Okay, welcome to the panel on fascism and nationalism. Our main speaker is Eric Kurlander, who is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of History and Director of Jewish Studies at Stetson University. He is the author of many books, including The Price of Exclusion, Ethnicity, National Identity, and the Decline of German Liberalism, Living with Hitler, Liberal Democrats in the Third Reich, Hitler's Monsters, A Supernatural History of the Third Reich, and Modern Germany, A Global History. We have two commentators. One was to have been Donatello, to whom we all owe an enormous debt of thanks and gratitude for his management of the logistics. He has written books on George Mosse and Italy and history, on the National Revolution, and he's working on a monograph about the myth of Rome in the fascist state, and his comments will be read by Skye. The second commentator, and I apologize for probably butchering the pronunciation of your name, Mercedes Peñalba-Sotorrío, who is a senior lecturer in European modern history at Manchester Metropolitan University. She's an expert on the history of the Franco regime, has written La Secretaria Generale di Movimento, Construcción, Coordinación y Estabilización del Regime Franquista, and she's currently at work on a monograph on Nazi propaganda campaigns in Spain and Spanish and German relations in World War II. Eric, take it away.
Thank you so much, Mary. And like everyone else, I just feel privileged to be part of these conversations, and it's really too bad that Donatello, not only that he got hurt, but someone who did so much for this conference, and this was his panel, and he had a lot to say, can't be here. So I just want to say in advance, he had great comments, and I can't wait to hear them and have that be part of the conversation. And Mercedes as well, thank you for that. And thanks to everyone for inviting me. So this is not my main research project at the moment. I just kind of use this opportunity to talk about nationalism and fascism to float some ideas that are in progress on a separate project. So I'm really interested in constructive feedback and criticism to what I'm about to say, especially towards the end. So early on in the Stanford seminar that inspired these proceedings, the historian Anatole Mazur, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asked his colleagues, is there any relationship between fascism and nationalism? Yes, George Mosse responded. It involves the matter of the folk. But I do feel very strongly that this origin of fascism was not necessarily aggressive. At the beginning, when we talk about origins, especially in Germany, Mosse continued, anti-Semitism does not play such a large part as you would think. Race does not play such a large part. This is important, as we'll see later on, that you can have the roots of fascism somewhere, but they're not necessarily pernicious at that point in time. In spite of all your emphasis on the whole European movement, Juan Linz responded, you are making it very much a description of German kinds of fascism. That has come up a lot so far. By focusing so much on the German romantic element. Nationalism has to be underlined, I think, in a different way from pure folk romantic ideas of nationalism. So Linz is the counterpoise here. The relationship between fascism and nationalism varied geographically, Linz insisted, insofar as folk romanticism found less resonance in Italian fascism or Francoism, where, quote, the anti-capitalist becomes linked with the nationalist in a non-romantic, pragmatic way. And you'll see some of those tensions, I think, with the comments. Now, there are clear thematic lacunae in the Stanford seminar. It was 60 years ago, especially when it comes to gender and sexuality, as we've discussed. But when it comes to questions of race and space, Mosse and his colleagues discussed the romantic antecedents of fascist nationalism in ways that remain instructive today. On the one hand, Mosse and company took a critical approach to what you might call German Geistesgeschichte, namely locating the roots of fascism in general and fascist nationalism in particular in cultural and intellectual trends endemic to the long 19th century. Some people would call that the Sonderweg, but I think they were more nuanced than that. At the same time, Mosse and his emigre colleagues were interested in inter- and transdisciplinary methods, invoking, quote, psychology and social history, in the words of Merrill Lehman, to strengthen the dynamic between universality and the particularity of these traditions. And that's something I think that Aristotle Callis brought up as well, the lens, right? To be sure, a number of cultural and intellectual historians after 1963 took up this critical historical tradition of excavating the folkish, the religio-mythological, indeed the romantic antecedents of fascism. But at least between the 60s and the 80s, maybe even the 90s, such approaches tended to be contested or marginalized in the historiography on fascism by more materialist and institutionalist accounts, emphasizing factors such as political economy, the crisis of capitalism, and structural challenges endemic to parliamentary democracy. I might call these the Marxist and liberal or Whig accounts, right? Or more recently, since the 90s, where we've seen more cultural and intellectual history of the 19th century, such interpretations have been called into question by scholars who reject causal links, right? It's about ambivalence and contradiction, any causal links between phenomena such as occultism, paganism, mythology, and border science or pseudoscience, what I call the supernatural imaginary in Hitler's Monsters, and fascist thinking around race and space. They don't think there's a real connection there. There are a number of scholars who would argue that. Meanwhile, historians of fascism studies, and German history and Italian history and fascism studies aren't always the same, as we've realized already in this conference, have tended simultaneously to focus on authoritarianism in one country or another, which has led the field into numerous cul-de-sacs, causing some scholars to argue that fascism, much less a specifically fascist form of nationalism, does not obtain as a transhistorical and transnational phenomenon. I wrote this a few months ago. That's definitely come up in this panel, or in these 3 days. Finally, though indebted to Adorno's work on the authoritarian personality, including the F scale, parallel efforts to create psychometric measures of fascism, and we have right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation and political psychology. These are kind of validated scales, have generally failed to take the link between romanticism and fascism seriously. So we have Americanists who agree that there's something we might call fascism that they can measure, but they don't look at the roots or origins of it in a cognitive sense. Like, where is that coming from in terms of maybe romantic thinking? And so they've tended to abandon the comparative theoretical and methodological framework that defined the transatlantic conversations epitomized by the Stanford Seminar. So they didn't have the tools yet, but Mosse and company wanted to do this stuff. So in this paper, I'd like to return to the 1963 Stanford Seminar as a foundation for further reflections on the romantic roots of fascist nationalism, highlighting the efforts to differentiate more folkish, indeed romantic conceptions of fascist nationalism from bourgeois liberal conceptions of nationalism. I then want to pursue this theme within the context of the dominant models of nationalism, constructivist, primordialist, national indifference. Some of you are certainly familiar with those, suggesting how we might negotiate or revise such models in coming to terms with the distinctions between liberal and fascist conceptions of race and space. And it's a good time to do this because the panel yesterday, part of the argument is there aren't clear distinctions between the two. I'm going to argue that there are some clear distinctions, at least heuristically. Third and finally, I want to return to this critical intellectual history, whether it comes from Geistesgeschichte and a critical bent or not, this history of ideas that was propagated by Mosse in 1963, and I would argue, and my colleagues would argue, A.O. Lovejoy already in the early 40s, right? And combine that with the methods of political psychology to propose ways of defining first theoretically and then testing empirically, as I think Paxton would argue we should do, the romantic cognitive framework or the ideological antecedents that undergird fascist conceptions of race and space, in contrast to more liberal institutionalist or Marxist materialist epistemologies that inform most constructivist accounts of nation building. Okay, so first the Stanford Seminar. And sorry for this can be a little clinical, but I want to get their conversation out there. During the seminar, the German political scientist and historian Karl Dietrich Bracher agreed with Mosse, later on in that conversation I started the talk with, that the pre-fascist nationalist movement in Europe thought about society and about the state, that there was a distinction between the pre-fascist nationalist movement in Europe and the fascist nationalist movement in the 20th century. There was also a distinction, he argued, this is Bracher, between pre-fascist and fascist nationalism when it came to racism, quote, and the question of minorities. The fascist notion of community, Bracher suggested, is not the same as traditional nationalism, unquote. Mosse agreed with Bracher that fascist nationalism is not the traditional nationalism. It's something once more profound and different. A couple days later, Mosse cited the elements of nature, history, and rootedness. So we'll see that's something that Lovejoy brings up already in the 40s, diversitarianism, right? That define the romantic view toward the folk, giving rise to a nationalism based on nature, historicity, and genuineness. Seton-Watson agreed that romantic nationalism was not based on material reality or everyday experience. That is, it was not a response to socioeconomic interactions with Jews or Slavs. Rather, one finds a most violent German pre-fascism and fascism in Styria and the Sudetenland, where there weren't many Jews, suggesting for Seton-Watson a new form of nationalism which comes in with the peasants, comes in with romanticism and religion, unquote. Interestingly here, for those who know the German Sonderweg debate, it was Gordon Craig, who's generally associated with that argument, who pushed back against the idea of a longer-term romantic basis for German nationalism, grounded in the intellectual traditions of the 19th century. Instead, he emphasized the socioeconomic and political crises of the immediate post-war period in triggering the spread of a hyper, or in his words, exasperated nationalism at all levels of society, unquote. Now, Mosse conceded, and Mosse rarely talks about economics, but Mosse conceded that economic reasons may have played a part, but folkish ideology dates back well before the war. Seton-Watson then added that using Marxist or materialist conceptions of the quote-unquote bourgeoisie as a general term obscures the point. It doesn't tell us anything. We want to know what these dissident elements were, in what respect they differ between Germany and other countries. Now, Seton-Watson agreed with Linz that many German and perhaps most Austrian anti-Semites were anti-clerical. This was a big tension, the role of religion and folkish nationalism and fascism. But folkish thinkers in Catholic Romania, he argued, were both closely aligned with the church and still fascist, still revolutionary, still obsessed with the Jewish problem. To Mosse's query, how would you explain these similarities and differences between German-speaking Central Europe and Latin Europe? That was a term Linz kept using. Seton-Watson therefore emphasized the common revolutionary elements that define fascist nationalism and anti-Semitism, regardless of the confessional or geographic context. That is, they just subsume religion into their folkish nationalism. It's not independent of it. This raised two questions about German fascism, Seton-Watson continued. A, why did the Germans become romantic nationalists and anti-Semites? And B, what was revolutionary and what wasn't? At this point, Linz again proposed that romantic, illiberal, even esoteric, semi-secret, he called it, nationalism was a peculiarly German response, thou doth protest too much, to the lack of national unity in comparison to Latin Europe. So he's really making that argument that there's no real similarities between Germany or Austria and the other fascist states. Mosse concurred regarding the merging of esoteric or religious faith and nationalism in the German context. Clearly, that might have been a stronger tradition, a Germanic religion that was to accompany the rise of Germanic consciousness, a romantic form of folkish Christianity. But whatever the ideological distinctions between Germany and Latin Europe, Seton-Watson, Bracher, and Mosse reaffirmed that fascism had moved beyond bourgeois 19th century liberal nationalism in Germany and elsewhere. As Brocker put it, paraphrasing Rauschning, paraphrasing Hitler, nationalism, Hitler supposedly said this, we know Rauschning was not quoting Hitler directly, nationalism can still be used because the mind of the German public lags behind, meaning the kind of more constrained 19th century nationalism works politically, but the real issue of the century and the real force of the century is racialism. This is supposedly what Hitler said. Or as Mosse put it, the triumph of the racial revolution. To which Linz added the important element of secularization and the strictly fascist or folkish element which differentiated fascism from traditional conservatism. So even Linz says there's something going on here that is not traditional nationalist conservatism or chauvinism. Now, before concluding the analysis of the Stanford seminar, I'm almost done, I want to turn briefly to the question of fascism and empire. Again, I wasn't quite sure what was going to be argued yesterday, but I think this fits in quite well. Namely, whether what they called at the conference German revisionism was distinct from bourgeois conservative or liberal revisionism, right? Because everyone agreed liberals are imperialists and kill lots of people. That was not up to debate at that conference. For Mosse, there might well have been a difference between bourgeois nationalist and folkish revisionism, which was more radical. So I guess excessive, right? Brocker agreed that Nazi revisionism was more extreme. And then Seton-Watson said Nazi revisionism was not only more extreme, but it wasn't unique in comparison to other fascist nationalisms. This is a quote. Hungary was one of the countries of fascism where it was absolutely paranoid. There was far more revisionism among the population in Hungary than in Germany, unquote. Italy was mentioned, Seton-Watson continued. It was inconceivable that fascism could have started without Gabriele D'Annunzio or the glorious May 1915. There comes a stage in the history of many countries where nationalism becomes completely paranoid. Japan, I think, was an example of that at a certain stage, unquote. In diagnosing fascism, Seton-Watson concluded, a, quote, connection exists between the paranoid degree of nationalism, where it becomes a difference in quantity. This is important. They're talking about quantity and measures and what I would call psychometric ways of figuring this stuff out. The quantity, and it's coinciding with economic depression. They also realize you have to look at actual historical context. Ideas are floating around. How are they operationalized, right? A little depression and a little nationalism is not enough. A great deal of repression and a great deal of nationalism are. That is for fascism, right? Where's the line to be drawn? I think this comes back to the more essential and the less essential. So I'm going to follow up with Seton-Watson here and say it's finding this line between fascist and more traditional liberal nationalism, including the more essential and less essential elements, that informs the rest of my talk. So John Connolly observes that nation states, especially those governed by illiberal forces, aggrandize themselves by seizing foreign territories, proximate, this is going to be important for later on, or distant, right? Nationalism is harnessed by a rules-based liberal order. So nationalism gets harnessed by a rules-based liberal order, or it becomes imperialism, or it becomes fascism, or both, unquote. That's Connolly. Indeed, a central question in examining fascist nationalism, as we saw in the seminar, is whether it is an extension of or a reaction against bourgeois 19th century liberal nationalism. According to constructivists like Ernest Gellner, Benedict Anderson, Eric Hobsbawm, nationalism was a product of bourgeois capitalist modernity, in which nationalists, first liberal, later conservative, maybe later fascist, there's a continuum, right, sought to create a state that is congruent with the ethnocultural nation. But as Connolly has noted, the constructivist model does little to account for ideological differences. For example, between West European nationalism, and I don't want to construct, as I'll say later on, the Hans Kohn, Hannah Arendt dichotomy here, but Connolly has just written, recently, right? We don't have a good way anymore of distinguishing between maybe a more liberal West European nationalism, which might have aligned more with liberal democracy, at least initially, and a later developing more folkish, more romantic Central and East European nationalism that may have been more prone to authoritarianism or even fascism. Now, the cultural, symbolic, or primordialist interpretation, people like Anthony Smith, diverges from the constructivist model in highlighting the essential role of pre-modern traditions, so history, myths, and symbols that constitute more romantic conceptions of nationalism. They're there well before the state, right? They precede the state. Nationalism, this is important also because we had that conversation the first day with Alessandra about the state being important for fascists, and it is, but I would argue in a different way. Nationalism may or may not have emerged with modernity and the state, but it certainly couldn't have emerged, according to primordialists, without invoking core elements of identity that preceded the 19th century: language, geography, culture, history. Nevertheless, primordialist accounts tend to ignore the very real and often divergent preoccupations among liberals and fascists when it comes to empire. That's just not part of what the nationalist studies people are often talking about, nor, with the exception of Marxists such as Hobsbawm, the role of colonialism, whether contiguous or overseas. It's just not central to constructivist interpretations. It goes without saying that models of national indifference are even more skeptical of primordialist accounts and lend even less credence to ordinary people's commitments to race, space, and empire, right? It's all complicated on the ground, and they don't even think about those things. In short, the field of nationalism studies, whether defined by classic constructivist accounts or more recent scholarship emphasizing national indifference, generally fails to differentiate clearly between liberal and fascist nationalisms across time and space, which makes the interventions of post-colonial scholars such as Thongchai Wunachaku or Emil Payne, not necessarily a post-colonialist, but he has a different perspective, or even Rogers Brubaker, helpful in rethinking the role of race and space in differentiating liberal and fascist conceptions of nation and empire. I do think the two things are linked. It's hard to talk about one without the other. Wunachaku introduces a concept of the geobody, the, quote, delineation and formation of a nation's territory, suggesting that is the nation's territoriality, the demarcation of its borders, that defines its existence, not the other way around, that a nation or people create the territory. That is, their territory can also precede the state and be something that is brought into fascist, I would argue, fascist nationalism. Working from the Russian-Soviet case, Emil Payne offers the concept of a multi-ethnic imperial nationalism to counter interpretations that view, quote, nationalism as one of the factors confronting or undermining empires. And this could be applied to the United States or Britain. You can be nationalist and incorporate other ethnicities if you have this kind of imperial nationalist or the Soviet Empire, right, approach to nationalism. Finally, we have Rogers Brubaker's homeland or trans-border nationalism, which seeks to transcend nationalizing nationalism. So we'll just be happy, like conservative nationalists or liberal nationalists, to the state we have, because it potentially is open to incorporating any territory containing ethno-national kin into the nation state. So guess what? If Canada seems a lot like the United States, why not annex it, right? We understand that based on the recent news in the United States. So if we invoke Brubaker's more capacious definition of homeland nationalism to include all those deemed Aryan, if not exclusively German or Italian, if we note that Nazi and to some extent fascist empire generally sought to confine itself, I would argue, to a contiguous geobody, living space that's nearby, right? And if we juxtapose this conception of fascist nation and empire to the more liberal imperial nationalism proposed by Payne, in which multiple ethnicities are constitutive and other territories across the ocean are constitutive, right? We might better differentiate between fascist and liberal conceptions of nation and empire. Now, many fascists were skeptical of bourgeois, pluralist, individualist conceptions of imperial nationalism endemic to the American, British, or French liberal states. The, quote, relationship between the individual and the state proposed by nationalism, this is Giovanni Gentile, right? He's come up, is grounded in a certain mystico-religious attachment. This is what Gentile argues. It's the direct antithesis of that advanced by individualistic liberalism and socialism. That is their conception of the nation and its relationship to the state. Fascism is, quote, an imperial mission. Again, he goes right into imperialism. It's connected for him. Not so much in the external world, Gentile writes elsewhere, but more so within Italy itself. In what seems like a quintessentially primordialist rejection of liberal or constructivist nationalism, Gentile argues that fascist nationalism, in fact, bases the state on the concept of the nation. The nation precedes the state. An entity that transcends the will and the personality of the individual because it is conceived as, well, he says it, objectively pre-existent, independent of the consciousness of individuals. Individuals do not labor to create it. The constituent elements that make up the nation, Gentile continues, anticipating Winnechakual, are territory and ethnicity, all of the same extrinsic nature, even when they are human in origin, like language, religion, and history. Couldn't get more primordialist than that. That's Gentile. In a detailed 1939 analysis of the Jewish question in Romania, a lot of the Nazis loved Romania and loved to talk about Romania, the Nazi writer Hans Schuster applauded the dissipation of liberal nationalism, which relied on the liberal capitalist bourgeoisie and progressive liberal democratic and republican world of thought. In contrast, he welcomed a newer form of nationalism grounded in race, space, and history, which no longer attempted to impose, this is that post-colonial kind of rhetoric that the Nazis and other fascists come up with. It didn't attempt to oppose inappropriate liberal models borrowed from abroad. It sounds like Benedict Anderson, right? Inappropriate liberal models borrowed from abroad, capitalism in the economy and parliamentarism in the state on rural patriarchal existence. Like, we've got our folkish primordial life here, Romania, Germany, Austria. Why would you impose these modal conceptions of nationalism on us, which is a stupid, antiquated 19th century bourgeois thing to do? And then we get Hitler. For Hitler, this liberal approach to race and space, again, I know liberal empires murdered lots of people and could be racist. I'm not contesting post-colonial or Marxist interpretations. I'm trying, for heuristic purposes, show that people perceive a difference. For Hitler, this liberal approach to race and space, whether in developing economic interdependencies with non-European states or acquiring overseas colonies populated with non-European races, constituted, he uses this term, national suicide, producing a situation, this is a direct quote, where European territory was laughably small compared to their remaining burden in colonies, foreign trade, etc. This is in Mein Kampf. Hitler's solution to Germany's economic and geopolitical challenges was to acquire more contiguous living space through an aggressive territorial policy, Bodenpolitik, per pen above, which could only occur by expanding within Europe, per Winnechakual, which could only occur by expanding within Europe, not Africa or Asia. Who cares about Africa or Asia as far as Hitler was concerned? That is, Hitler's preoccupation with space was both more and less aggressive than liberal states. More aggressive in seeking living space from its neighbors. Let's just incorporate them. They don't really deserve their own state anyway. They're kind of like us, right? But less aggressive in seeking primarily contiguous territory that could be populated by Aryan peoples while gradually depopulating it of foreign races via intercolonization. So in some ways, fascist nationalism, I would argue, is less aggressive than fascist imperialism is less aggressive and ambitious than liberal imperialism. I think history shows that in some ways. This does not mean that Nazism or fascism failed to entertain the possibility of a multi-ethnic empire. We know that Rosenberg and Himmler debated it in terms of Eastern Europe and the Baltic countries and maybe good Ukrainians, and then Hitler's like, yeah, I have no interest. I don't want to do that. Or at least loose alliances with putatively kindred Aryan peoples. Well before the foundation of Italian fascism or Nazism, folkish theories of pan-Aryanism, right, grounded in romantic conceptions of race and space that come out of literally the Grimm brothers and Fichte and Schlegel and everyone, propagated the idea that a shared Indo-Aryan civilization connected all great empires, the Japanese, the Indian, the Persian, the Greco-Roman, and the Germanic. Here we're reminded of, quote, the malleability of fascism in time and space, unquote. Robert Paxton, right? Since fascist ideology drew its legitimacy not from a universal principle, Romanticism is not coherent, right? Much less liberal institutionalism or dialectical materialism. They don't care about modal ways of organizing state or society. But from, this is Paxton, from what it considers the most authentic elements of its own community identity, right? It was this ideological malleability around racial or ethnic community. I decide, even Goering, right? I decide who's a Jew. That permitted the Third Reich to seek alliances with Japan and at least contemplate similar arrangements with Indian and Arab nationalists while designating neighboring Slavs and Jews who had lived there thousands of years, hundreds of years, as the racial enemy. It makes no sense in terms of biology or anthropology. But Romanticism doesn't care about biology or anthropology, right? So to finish up this section, as Tara Zara has recently pointed out, there were clear racial and spatial limitations, or clear limitations to operationalizing folkish conceptions of race and space globally. Even liberal empires were becoming chauvinistic in the 30s, right? 20s and 30s. There's no way that the fascists were actually going to pursue global ideas that were all united in some way. They used it rhetorically, but the axis did not work very well, as we know. The signatories of the Tripartite Pact, whether Germany, Italy, or Japan, thought primarily in terms of ethnically homogeneous and territorially contiguous empire, as suggested by Gentile above, very eloquently. The Nazi fellow traveler, Carl Schmitt, endorsed a, quote, regionally based political and economic bloc dominated by a single hegemonic power, to avoid the pathologies of universalistic liberal international law. A theory, he called it regionalization, that helped provide, quote, the conceptual foundations for a Nazi-dominated European Grossraum as an alternative to the twin universalistic sisters of Anglo-American liberalism and Soviet communism, unquote. Like Hitler, Schmitt selectively cited American history as a model, in this case the Monroe Doctrine, we talked about Frederick Jackson Turner at breakfast, to justify this regionalization of empire. But he did not want an immigration society, a multi-ethnic society. In reality, Schmitt's and Hitler's model of empire, it was not Emil Paine, right, was decidedly romantic, folkish, and illiberal. As Sarah Ponser reminds us, the fascist empire was predicated on two core assumptions. Space was a finite resource, rendered even more so by the historical experience of liberal imperialism. They took everything already, right? These are the have-nots. And that the problem of space had rendered older liberal political assumptions and institutions obsolete, unquote. So now I get to the last part. So now that we've established descriptively, at least, and this is purely in the realm of a history of ideas, I concede, as I think many of us probably would, we haven't operationalized anything yet. We've compared ideas across time and space. We've established a difference between liberal and fascist forms of nationalism. The question posed by Seton-Watson remains: are there essential ideological or cognitive features that inform fascist nationalism, distinct from liberal nationalism? Elements that might precede or anticipate fascism more generally. People aren't born fascist. What is it in the way they view the world and digest the world and operate in society and culture, economy, what have you, everyday life, that might make them susceptible to fascism? For Connolly, who's expressed his own reservations with dominant nationalism paradigms, the difference between seemingly liberal Western and seemingly illiberal Central European models comes down to distinct historical experiences. Quote, the more the rights to self-government of Central Europeans stalled in comparison to France or Great Britain, the more the voices of fear and exclusion rose, and the more politics radicalized, especially in the decades after the failed revolution of 1848. I know this sounds a little Zonderweggy. Shifting emphasis from more liberal to perhaps more ethically essentialist, indeed proto-fascist conceptions of nationalism and empire. That's my summary. Mosse himself suggests something similar in the introduction to Masses and Man, where he distinguishes between a humanistic 19th century liberal nationalism and later developing radical and democratic nationalism that, in creating false collectivities, are both more chauvinist, or is both more chauvinist and more dangerous to individual freedom. So he's also using this dichotomy. Now, historicizing different conceptions of nationalism, or fascism for that matter, across time and space, suggesting, for example, that Central European nationalism might have inculcated more folkish or romantic elements than West European nationalism, is part of the answer to Seton-Watson's question. That's kind of what they're implying in 1963. Certainly, we can highlight these different historical experiences of nation building or thinking about race and space without reifying the ideological distinctions between East, civic, right, Hans Kohn, and West European ethnic nationalism. So we don't have to go back to Hans Kohn or Hannah Arendt in order to see that there are different historical experiences which produce different outcomes, right? But they're contingent. Nationalist movements, whether in Europe, Africa, or Asia, were often tied to demands for greater democracy, right? While those who opposed such nationalisms, whether it was Metternich or Queen Victoria, were often conservative monarchists. There's nothing inherently fascist about being nationalist. Conversely, since 1945, we've seen the resurgence of nativist and alt-right movements across Western Europe and North America, belying any claims that such phenomena or such patterns are unique to putatively illiberal, undemocratic, or underdeveloped societies. We can both identify the variegated forms of nationalism across time and space, it's not modular, right? And simultaneously recognize that many seemingly liberal societies contain the ideological potential for fascist forms of nationalism. But how do we identify that? How do we locate that? Indeed, since the 1990s, many scholars, including Mosse at the end of his life, worked to define the distinct elements of fascist nationalism. For Zev Sternhell, reflecting on Mosse's definition and recalling much of the discussion in the Stanford seminar, quote, fascist ideology represented a synthesis of organic tribal nationalism with the anti-materialist revision of Marxism. For Roger Griffin, he's come up a lot, fascism was defined by radical and revolutionary paleogenetic ultranationalism, part of his new consensus. Whether or not it is, we can debate. Jeff Ely invokes a militantly racialist nationalism. The political scientists Tamir Baron and Jeffrey Bale agree that fascism rests on a combination of illiberal nationalism and non-Marxist socialism. Meanwhile, Stefan Breuer, Donatello, Aramani highlight the role of revolutionary paleogenetic nationalism in defining fascism across space, whether in France, Germany, or Italy. But despite this relative consensus regarding the role of organic, tribal, illiberal, paleogenetic nationalism in defining fascism across time and space, the reasons why this kind of nationalism tends both to precede, the historical stages here, again, Paxton are important, tends to both precede and manifest alongside fascism is not always clear. Which is why returning to the persistent elements of mysticism, of esotericism, indeed of romanticism, which played a substantial role in the Stanford seminar discussions, is helpful. Now, in his classic work, Political Romanticism, first published in 1919, Carl Schmitt argued, a decade before Benjamin, that the romanticization, and by that he often meant aestheticization, of politics undermined the functionality of liberal democratic institutions. So, okay. In Science as a Vocation, published a year later, or the same year, Weber argued that the ultimate and most sublime values essential to effective political engagement have retreated from public life into the transcendental realm of mystic life. Adorno compared fascism to, he said it's connected to occultism by the thought patterns of the ilk of anti-Semitism. And then Gentili again. Many times, Il Duce, with profound intuition of fascist psychology, you know, I was saying we need to look at psychology, political psychology, psychometrics, has affirmed this truth. We all respond to a sort of mystic sentiment. Within that mystic state, clear and distinct ideas hardly formulate themselves. Excellent, right? You don't have to have a program. They cannot be expressed in precise propositions, nor can the links in the reasoning of a faith be reconstructed. It's just romantic. It's intuition. Or as Rosenberg grudgingly observed in 1941, because he didn't like occultism, Many Germans, due to their proclivity for the romantic and the mystical, indeed the occult, came to understand the success of National Socialism in this fashion. I don't know how that happened, but I guess that's why we did well. Mosse built on such diagnoses, arguing that the character of folkish nationalist thought was romantic, and I'll skip the quotes from Mosse because we all know his work. Meanwhile, Adorno, one of the progenitors of modern political psychology, talked about the romantic elements in fascism when he did his F-scale. There were questions about your religious feeling and basically things having to do with border scientific commitments, conspiracism, and what have you. And yet it's only in the past decade or two that we've returned to these phenomena, esotericism, mysticism, spiritualism, border science, paganism, mythology, affective religion, as direct causal links to understanding fascism. Remember, the revisionist trend 15 years ago is those don't have anything to do with fascism. They're subversive and they're alternative, and the Nazis and the Italian fascists didn't like those things, right? The problem remains, though, or the challenge, we can describe empirical relationships among various measures. So even psychometricians say, well, whether paranormal or intuitionism, we can show a shared correlation between the belief in the Loch Ness Monster, Area 51, and anti-democratic beliefs. Political scientists are doing this all the time. But what are they actually measuring? I would argue they're measuring a cognitive framework that those are expressions of that cognitive framework, romanticism, which is why it's helpful. I have 2 pages left, so maybe 3 minutes. Which is why it's helpful in combining intellectual, historical, Mosse and company, and psychometric approaches, and returning to the German-born intellectual historian Arthur Lovejoy for methodological precision. In a seminal 1941 article, after decades of relative skepticism, Lovejoy himself, he was not someone who wanted to blame Nazism on the Romantic era or Byron or Herder, right? But in this 1941 article, he came to the conclusion that Hitlerism was indeed a byproduct of the German Romantic movement, but not in a static one-to-one sense. Like many historians, Lovejoy viewed Romanticism as their aesthetic reaction to the Enlightenment's fixation on individualism, process, and uniformity. So yeah, many historians say Romanticism was a reaction against materialism, Enlightenment, liberalism, individualism. But what distinguished Lovejoy's approach to much previous work on Romanticism is that he recognized, anticipating Mosse's comments in the Stanford seminar, that one could insist simultaneously on a certain specific historical connection between the intellectual revolution of the Romantic period and the tragic spectacle of Europe in 1940, unquote, and accept that Romanticism might manifest itself dynamically over time and space. Ideas are not static, even if there are certain core unit ideas within them, which is why he suggested that maybe Romanticism, which core cognitive features include diversitarianism, Eigentumlichkeit, always wanting to separate yourself, your culture, your own intuition from others, right? Das Ganze, organicism, striving or streben, Gemeinschaft, communitarianism, among others, might obtain across time and space, but could manifest differently in distinct socio-political contexts. As I've argued in a recent paper with some colleagues, we can all agree that in the 1790s, Romanticism included tolerance, Catholicity, and free self-expression as an artist, even if in its later expressions, it seemed to transmogrify into racialism in art and a commitment to ethno-nationalism. So, in conclusion, we began by looking at how scholars convening at the Stanford seminar seemingly recognized that fascist nationalism was distinct from liberal nationalism, that theories of fascist nationalism should be derived from a transhistorical and a transnational approach to the phenomena, and that a romantic conception of race and space appeared to be a distinctive element in constituting both fascism and fascist nationalism. In light of these discussions, I argued that we should combine the theoretical premises of a critical history of ideas, per Lovejoy or Mosse, with the methods of political psychology to help us differentiate fascist from liberal nationalism, not only descriptively, but psychometrically. So then we turned to the copious literature on nationalism, talked about how the constructivist accounts, primordialist accounts, national indifference don't really help us make any kind of heuristic distinction. So what are we going to test, right? We don't have models that help us distinguish. You have to come up with a model first. No, I'm done, right? So, yeah. So I 2 sentences. So finally, I then argued that the epistemological roots of this distinction between fascist and liberal attitudes towards race, space, and empire lie in a romantic cognitive framework, right? That informs fascist conceptions of the world, drawing not only on Mosse and Adorno, but Lovejoy's concept of unit ideas. We can identify a romantic idea complex expressed by everyday commitments to esoteric, paranormal, conspiracist, border scientific thinking, Area 51, Loch Ness Monster, I can speak to my dead grandmother, right? And that appears to constitute a driver of anti-democratic beliefs, reflecting a proclivity to embrace fascist conceptions of race, space, and national identity transhistorically and transnationally. Thank you.